allow me to briefly go back to the immediate post-1945 period, because I think it's important to know what the European Union grew out of. So in the immediate post-1945 period, the West, that is the United States and Western powers, Canada and so on, were determined to preserve Western Europe from communism. That was one of the biggest goals in the aftermath of World War II. And to do that, the West created various institutions to make sure that Western Europe would not fall in the hands of the communists. So one really big milestone there was the Truman Doctrine in March 1947, which provided a political guarantee to support the free peoples that were trying to resist subjugation by communists. And that could be communists in other countries, but it could also be communist parties within various European states, for instance, in Italy, France, and so on. In addition to the Truman Doctrine, there was the Marshall Plan in 1948, and I think it's important for us to understand that the Marshall Plan, by providing very significant economic aid to Western Europe, helped the West European war-torn economies back on their feet and significantly helped to stabilize Western Europe. And one other organization to keep in mind that came about in this early post-45 period is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was created in 1949. Now, if you think, again, in terms of a big picture, economically, we also see the creation of the Bretton Woods system that was already discussed as early as 1944, but out of it come organizations that became really quite important, namely the International Monetary Fund, to alleviate problems of currency instability, then the World Bank, which initially, in the early days, largely provided long-term loans also to rebuild the war-torn West European economies. Of course, later it became involved globally. And finally, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, which now, of course, is the World Trade Organization, which facilitated trade by lowering trade barriers, tariff barriers. Right? So if you look at this as the institutional context out of which the European Union developed, I think it's helpful as background information. So now if we look at the European Union itself, I just want to highlight some of the main developments again, because I think it's really important to keep them in mind before we can really discuss where it's headed. You probably recall that the first of the European communities was the European Coal and Steel Community, founded in 1951. It had 6 original signatories, namely France, then the Federal Republic of Germany, the Benelux countries, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and Italy. So these are the founding members of what we now know as the European Community. It was initially a free trade area for products such as coal and steel and iron and ore to ensure the orderly supply of these products to these 6 member states. But it would be not a good perspective to only look at this European coal and steel community in terms of economic benefits, in terms of a free trade area. In my mind, equally important, or maybe even more important, are the security implications of this organization. It was proposed to assure that war between France and Germany would become impossible in the future. Because now there is control over these products that typically iron, ore, and so on are typically used in the production of armaments. So this was much more than an economic arrangement. And that's, again, important to keep in mind. If you think about the countries that joined the European Coal and Steel Community, they were all countries that either had been defeated in World War II or had been occupied during the war. So very significant political security implications in addition to the economic ones. Now, if we move along in terms of chronological developments, another organization that's crucial to keep in mind is the European Defense Community, which was discussed in the early 1950s. Recall in the bigger picture, the outbreak of the Korean War, and the Americans and the West Europeans were convinced that what had just happened in Korea is basically a dress rehearsal for what would likely happen in Europe. So there's a significant threat in the international system. The community reacts to it, and it decides to shore up its military capabilities. So there is a need for a greater West European contribution in the field of defense, and there's discussion about West German rearmament. Think about this. This is the early 1950s, so not long after the end of World War II. France is terrified, of course, about a West German military contribution, and yet there is a significant Soviet threat, and Western Europe needs to do something. So the French decide that they will propose the creation of a European army, to which the Germans would provide troops, and that would prevent an independent German army, which would be the worst case scenario for France. So the French make this proposal. The US initially is not very excited about this. It would much rather have seen German rearmament in the context of NATO, because that probably could have happened much more easily. But they say, okay, we can't just dictate to Western Europe what to do, so we'll see whether these negotiations can go on. They do. There's finally agreement in 1952, and the same countries that signed the European Coal and Steel Community Treaty sign a treaty to give rise to a European army, where each of the signatories provides troops to a common European defense arrangement. But, as you know from carefully reading Andrew Moravcik's chapter for tonight, this European army never came about. And so the irony of it is that even though the French proposed the creation of this arrangement to prevent an independent German army, in 1953, something happened in the international system that changed the mind of many people in France. And the event I'm referring to is the death of Stalin. With the death of Stalin, there is now the thought that the threat stemming from the Soviet Union has decreased significantly, and therefore it's no longer in France's interest to curtail its autonomy, to curtail its freedom of action, give up its own army, as it would have had to do for this European army. So the French National Assembly fails to ratify the European Defense Community Treaty and therefore kills it. So very interesting. The French propose it, and then they defeat it. So in 1954, progress toward greater security cooperation cannot come about. But there's a shimmer of hope, because now the Europeans decide that they push further with respect to economic integration. And so only a year after the failure of this European army, in 1955, there are talks to bring about greater economic cooperation. And I need to shorten this a little bit, because otherwise we won't get to where I really want to get. Then in 1957, you get the Treaties of Rome, which just celebrated the 50th anniversary of these. And these Treaties of Rome, as you know, established two further institutions, namely Euratom and the European Economic Community. So I'm racing ahead here. We're now by 1968, and by then the Europeans, the members of the European Community, have accomplished a common market in which they now eliminated internal barriers, internal tariffs, set common external tariffs, and are on their way toward this common market that eventually, in later stages, also leads to free movement of people's goods, services, and capital. But we'll get there in a little while. So you can see the European Union has moved fairly rapidly, and the members have curtailed their autonomy more and more over the course of several decades. Maybe two other developments just to highlight again, and you read about them. Another big development in the context of European developments was the creation of the Single European Act, which got rid of additional non-tariff barriers to trade. That's when we got things like the German beer purity law, which was declared as an impediment to trade and had to go, and 299 other directives along those lines. So I can talk about these in Q&A if you'd like, but I know I have talked about them in this audience previously. Obviously, there are new people and so on, but I'm going to skip that for now. And the other development to look at is the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, and that essentially brought about further political changes. It led to the strengthening of some of the organizations of the European Union, particularly the Commission and the European Parliament. It brought about majority voting on many measures, because the Europeans recognized that if they had a requirement of unanimity, pretty soon the entire organization would be immobilized. So they moved to majority voting for many of the measures that were being discussed. There was also progress made in terms of immigration issues. There was a discussion of a common foreign and security policy. So you see with Maastricht, the EU moves even further along on this continuum. And it's not just economic integration so much, but now much greater integration in the realm of politics and security issues. Justice and home affairs, if you'd like, is a subgroup of these issues. Okay, that was my first big point. The EU has come a long ways. From 51 to where we are now, a lot has happened, and I could only sketch that very coarsely. My second big point is the European Union went from 6 founding members to 27 now. It was founded as the European Coal and Steel Community in 51. It took till 1973 for the European community to add new members. In 73, it added Denmark, Ireland, and the UK. Then in 1981, Greece. In 86, Spain and Portugal. So it's moving further south as these countries become democracies. They become eligible for European community membership. Now in 1995, 3 countries came on board: Austria, Finland, and Sweden. And note, not Norway. And we can talk about that too. So by then, anything past 1992, we referred to this organization as the European Union. It was renamed with the Maastricht Treaty. In 2004, by far the biggest enlargement, as you know, that's when 8 Central and East European countries came on board, plus Cyprus and Malta. And then the most recent round, 2007, Bulgaria and Romania. So that's where we are right now. Very briefly, what are the membership criteria? Because we'll have to ask, of course, who else is getting in, who is likely not to get in. Just to remind you, the membership criteria, also referred to as the Copenhagen criteria, because that's where these membership criteria were rethought. We're told by the European Union that any European country that adheres to the following principles is eligible for membership. Needs to be democratic, needs to abide by the rule of law, human rights, and has to have respect for minorities. then a country that wants to join the European Union needs to have a functioning market economy and the capacity to cope with competitive pressure. And that's interpretable. You'll see that there are loopholes for this. And then it needs to have the ability to apply EU rules and policies. That's typically referred to as the acquis communautaire, and that's roughly 100,000 pages by now. They go back through numerous to old treaties that are kind of all combined in this acquis communautaire. So those are the criteria that countries need to be able to meet to be eligible for European Union membership. Enlargement will continue, and it's a point that I will return to in just a few minutes. So let me get to my third point. I want to suggest that the EU has made greater progress in some issue areas than in others. And that, I just want to stress this continuum in a sense that I've begun to outline. It started with this free trade area for steel and coal, which, yes, was an economic arrangement with security implications. The EDC, the European Army, failed, so no progress in the early 50s on security. Then all the progress you see over the next few decades is economic. You see the creation of a common market, the customs union, a common market, and onward to a common currency, very important, the creation of the euro. But then, following the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, you see progress in the security realm. You, for instance, see the creation of a European Rapid Reaction Force that is roughly a military group of 60,000 people that are supposed to be deployable very quickly and need to be able to be deployed for roughly a year. So there is progress toward cooperation in the security realm, but of course it's nothing along the lines of a European army that was envisioned in the early and mid-1950s. There's also talk in 2003 about a European security and defense policy. But overall, if you look at this continuum, the EU still has been clearly much more successful economically than it has in terms of high politics, if that's still even an acceptable term. So much more progress in the economic and the financial realm than in the security realm. And that's pretty obvious because countries are less willing to curtail their sovereignty when it comes to hard politics than they are when they are dealing with economic issues. Not that economics doesn't matter, don't get me wrong, but putting your people in harm's way is still in a different category for decision makers. Maybe something else to say with respect to this greater progress being made with respect to some issue areas than in others. Another point to add to this is that not everyone can go at the same speed. If you look carefully, for instance, who is a member of the Eurozone right now, we know that there are 27 European Union members, but only 15 right now have the euro. Others are working toward that goal. Several of them have not been able to meet the very stringent convergence criteria that it takes to be able to become a member of the Eurozone. There are also some countries that exempted themselves from certain policies. Oftentimes it's the British that tend to be the troublemakers in the context of the EU. Sometimes it's the Danes or the Dutch, depending on what issues we talk about. So some countries seem to move greater toward this integration and than others. So this could lead to a European Union, which political scientists oftentimes refer to as a European Union of variable geometry. Some simply move faster and others may be left behind, maybe we'll catch up, something we can talk about. Okay. That gets me to my last big point. I want to stress that even though the European Union is the most successful, as Andrew Moravci calls it, international organization in human history, there have been setbacks. And I also want to say that international organization is really not a good term for the European Union. So if you're interested in why that's not the case, we can pick that up in Q&A as well. He knows that too. He's simplifying. But I find it problematic to refer to it as such because it really isn't an international organization. But okay. So even though the EU has made great strides, there were setbacks. One of them I already discussed, the failure of the European army. Another one that I'm sure you're aware of is the Constitution for Europe. Giscard d'Estaing spent a lot of time figuring out what this constitution should look like, and with a variety of policymakers, citizens from EU member states, worked out this treaty text that became very complex and complicated, and put it in front of the citizens of the EU countries. And as you have heard, undoubtedly, when it came to ratifying this treaty, the French and the Dutch defeated the treaty in their national referenda. That was largely due to domestic reasons, and they simply took out the anger on the European Union rather than on their individual nation states. This then led to what was called diplomatically period of reflection. I'm happy to say under the German EU presidency, our Chancellor Angela Merkel managed to get the EU heads of state and government to agree on a new text. And now we are once again awaiting the renewed ratification process. And now the key is to push through this new shortened, more user-friendly constitution, push it through parliamentary votes, and not give it to the citizens for popular referenda again, because then the danger is high, to say the least, that some member states might defeat this process again, and then we're back to square one. So if we want to have a European constitution, and it looks like this one is an improvement over the old one, although most of the major provisions are still in there, then it's much easier to have it ratified by Parliament than by popular referendum. Okay, so the point, the EU has made huge success, has been very successful, but there are setbacks. Now, where is it headed from here? I wanted to have 4 little subpoints, trying to help you structure this because I'm not writing on a board. Let me see how far I get. If I go too far into Q&A, you'll have to stop me and we can pick up these points later. Well, first of all, in terms of where is it headed, we'll see more enlargement, but everybody knows enlargement will not be unlimited. The former republics of Yugoslavia are likely to get in eventually. Croatia is already a candidate country, along with Macedonia. Serbia is going to have problems. Serbia is already having problems right now. One still being that it is asked to hand over further war criminals, and it has improved its record there, and the European Union has acknowledged this. But the bigger problem right now is Kosovo. If Kosovo declares independence, Serbia is going to be very upset. The EU has already announced that it will support Kosovo in this and will also recognize Kosovo as an independent state. So that will lead to problems and will delay Serbia's entrance into the European Union. The other very big issue, and we've spent an entire session on this a year ago or so, is Turkey. And I know you've thought about this extensively. The European Union has opened some chapters of accession negotiations, but it's delayed doing so on others. And it's waiting for Turkey to open its port and airports to goods from Cyprus before it really engages in further negotiations with respect to some of these accession points. There's also need for further reform in Turkey. It has made improvements, particularly with respect to human rights, but there's still some problem areas and need to improve its record there. But if we want to be honest about this, even if Turkey fulfills all these criteria, the bigger issues are geography, because remember, the membership criterion for EU membership is that you're physically located in Europe, and Turkey fulfills this requirement only with the part basically Istanbul. And as soon as you cross the Bosporus, you are in Asia. Now, will the European Union be flexible on this? Who knows? But certainly this is a big consideration, and quite frankly, the EU should have thought about this before it started accession talks, because it'll make it look pretty poorly if it now decides it qualified as a European country at some point and all of a sudden no longer does, with the geography not having changed in the meantime. So geography could be an issue. The very big one is that Turkey is a Muslim country and that the EU member states are Christian. They're Protestants, they're Catholics, but they're not Muslim. And many people seem to have a big issue with that. Again, it seems to me that that's something they should have considered earlier, because obviously Turkey was always a predominantly Muslim country. The third strike that Turkey might have against it is its size. It has 70, 80 million people, and it would be one of the biggest EU member states and certainly change a lot of the internal dynamics. Again, is that reason enough to keep it out? It totally depends on where you stand on these debates, but these are some of the main issues that are mentioned by those who are not happy about discussions bringing Turkey into the EU. You can think of a lot of selling points. Geography, again, in some sense, opening the door to the Middle East. It could be a very important strategic arrangement, but of course then others argue that why do we need this? Turkey is already a member of NATO, so why do we need it in the EU? For security reasons, we already have it in the western side. Lots of debates you can have around that. Maybe for right now, till we can bring this up in Q&A, I just want to suggest that maybe the strategy to have toward Turkey right now would be to keep the carrot of membership dangling. Because as long as you have this carrot and countries think that they could become members, they do a lot in terms of reforms, in terms of strengthening their democracy, in terms of moving toward a truly free market economy. When all hope is gone, when the carrot disappears, there's little in terms of reforms. And we've seen this with the Central and East European countries, and they knew that they would eventually get in and therefore have done a lot in a fairly short period of time. But if Turkey were to be told right now that there's no way it'll ever get in, it has no incentive to do any of these things that we would like for it to do. So certainly it's in everybody's interest to see whether Turkey can fulfill these requirements and then see how picky people want to be. It might be a very good idea, actually, to have Turkey as a member of Europe. But it depends on whom you ask. France, for instance, right now seems to think that it's a horrible idea if you ask Sarkozy. And all it takes is one country voting against it, because important questions are still decided by unanimity, and that would be the end of accession. Okay? So the EU will enlarge further, but it will not enlarge indefinitely. Next question then becomes, what should happen to the countries that will not get into the European Union? The European Union is surrounded by a lot of states still in Central and Eastern Europe. The borders have been pushed further with this enlargement in 2004. And there are lots of countries, the North African countries, Morocco, Tunisia. You can think of the Middle East and moving to Lebanon or Palestinian Authority, Syria, and on and on. These are all countries that are now the European Union's immediate neighbors. And the European Union had to ask itself, what policies should it pursue with respect to these neighbors, because it needs to stabilize its immediate neighborhood. And so in 2003, the European Commission developed a white paper, they're always called white papers, to create, and I quote here, a zone of prosperity and a ring of friends with these new immediate neighbors. And it had to figure out how it promotes stability and prosperity, and therefore came up with what it labeled action plans with respect to every one of these countries. These action plans are very detailed. You can actually look at them online if you're interested, what kinds of things the EU asks in terms of human rights, in terms of economic progress, in terms of strengthening, moving toward more democratic systems, in exchange then for greater access to the EU market. But this whole European neighborhood policy, as it became known, is quite tricky, because this is a very asymmetric relationship. The EU countries are the powerful ones in this relationship. The North African countries and the countries further to the east of Europe are much weaker with respect to almost all economic indicators, and therefore this is very asymmetric. So the EU cannot really dictate, or should not, it could, but it certainly would not be in its interest to dictate to these countries what to do, because the membership carrot isn't there, so they will not just say, we'll do whatever you say because we want to get in. So it has to be very careful to figure out what the correct policies are, because if it gets it wrong, it could destabilize the neighborhood. And it's not one policy will work for all of those, because those are very heterogeneous countries. Palestine, for instance, is quite different from an Algeria or from Moldova. So you have to study these countries extremely carefully and figure out what's your best option. But the EU at least is trying to establish greater institutional relations with its new neighbors. So that's the plan for those who will not get in. The European Union, my next point will be, is not just widening, enlarging, but it also wants to deepen further. It wants to move toward greater integration, and particularly greater cooperation with respect to foreign affairs. The European Union currently does not have a common defense policy. If you think about the Gulf Wars, if you think about the crises in Iraq and now the Iraq War, if you think about the problems in the Balkans, in Bosnia and Kosovo, the European Union did not speak with one voice there. Certainly didn't speak with one voice with respect to Iraq. The UK joined the US. The French, the Germans adamantly opposed. So there is no common foreign and security policy in the European Union right now. Why? There are a lot of different cultures. We're talking about 27 member states, and being in Italy, you may have very different ideas about what would be good for your country than if you are in Poland or in Austria or in Sweden. Right? So these are different cultures. These countries have varying historical interests, and they have no common political will at the moment. Moreover, and that was mentioned in your text, there is a need to overcome this philosophical division between Atlanticists and Europeanists. The Atlanticists, countries like Britain, the Netherlands, and Portugal, emphasized closer ties with the US, as the name suggests. The Europeanists, particularly France, Italy, Spain, and sometimes Germany, seek greater European independence. And so depending on what camp you're in, you have different preference orderings when it comes to decisions with respect to international politics. Also, still a divisive factor with respect to foreign affairs is the whole issue of burden sharing. The US always says to the Europeans, you guys got to do more for the common defense. And the Europeans oftentimes think that they're doing enough. But some are willing to do more than others to contribute to the defense in this post-Cold War environment. So right now, when it comes to security issues, the Europeans largely focus on what they call the Petersburg tasks. Petersburg is a little town outside of Bonn, Germany. That's where this agreement was made. Petersburg tasks essentially deal with humanitarian, rescue, peacekeeping, and crisis management issues. So the Europeans, the EU member states, are quite active when it comes to securing the international environment. They are, in fact, the second largest peacekeeper after the United States. So it's not that they're not pulling their weight at all, but they have different ideas of where to get involved and how to get involved than the US does. That leads me 2 more points and I'm done. So I might almost make it. Second to last is the European Union as a superpower. And in your supplemental reading in the text, it mentioned a book by John McCormick, European Superpower, published in 2007. I actually make my students read this, and I can recommend it if you're interested in this issue of whether the European Union now is becoming a superpower. What has changed recently? Well, the argument in this book basically is that now there is much greater emphasis on the markets, on trade, on technology, and on the interdependence between the countries globally. So force has lost much of its utility. So having a large military arsenal, and the US clearly is the largest state militarily, outdoes anyone by far. Having a large military arsenal, according to the scholar, is a lot less important in today's world than it was during the Cold War. So the Europeans have a preference for diplomacy, for economic development, for having political influence in the world, because they feel that most threats today demand non-military solutions, and therefore there's really no need for them to have the size of a military that the United States does. Most threats today, as I said, demand non-military solutions, and therefore Europe prefers to have what's called soft power rather than hard power. It wants to be able to influence, it wants to be able to persuade others, rather than to immediately become militarily involved. So the US in this book is labeled a hegemon, the most powerful country in the world. It was called a hyperpower by the French. It is often obviously called a superpower, but many scholars observe that the US may be in decline. Even though it is still much more powerful than other countries militarily, it doesn't always achieve its political objectives using military force. And the examples that are typically given you're familiar with, it's obviously the Vietnam War and current debates about Iraq. Europe, on the other hand, is labeled a quiet superpower. It has economic power, political and diplomatic influence, or if you'd like, it's referred to as a civilian power. So it's for you to decide again, superpower or civilian power. And if you look at economic indicators, the European Union combined with respect to many of the economic indicators, already has surpassed the US. In fact, I brought some of the figures in a booklet, and I'd be happy to let you have a copy of those. In fact, I brought several handouts that in the end, feel free to take home. Okay, last point is briefly looking at EU-US relations. We sort of segued into this already. The European Union and the US are each other's main trading partners in goods and services. So clearly this transatlantic relation is very important, and nobody is trying to say otherwise, regardless of how many differences we have. It is by far the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world, and these two economies are highly interdependent. The US and the European Union also promote common values. They are in favor of democratic development in the rest of the world, obviously promote peace, freedom, the rule of law. They encourage democratization and market integration. They work together globally to deal with the new challenges that the world faces today: terrorism, weapons proliferation, drugs, organized crime, and on. But they do have the differences, and you are aware of this. For instance, different positions with respect to the death penalty. If you're a member of the European Union, you cannot have the death penalty. That's not written as one of the Copenhagen criteria, but none of the European member states does. And there's a lot of debate, pros and cons on that, but the Europeans are anti-death penalty. They have differences with respect to certain trade agreements. And they certainly had their differences in Iraq. But those differences do not stand in the way of productive cooperation across the Atlantic. And that's important to keep in mind when we look at this relationship. So I got through my main points, and I want to close before I open up for Q&A by just letting you know that I've done a project on the European neighborhood policy, so I could tell you a little bit more about this if you'd like, although it's a very preliminary assessment because it takes quite a while for these action plans to actually be implemented. And so at this point, in the book I did with several colleagues, we had to speculate a fair amount. But the new project now will be looking at the European Union and East Asia. Now that I've studied the European Union, and I am from Europe, of course, for quite a few years, I'm interested in seeing Europe, in my mind, was quite the success story and is. If you think about how destroyed it was at the end of World War II, and these great animosities, particularly between the French and the Germans, it's inconceivable in my mind that you would see these two countries going to war today. Inconceivable. They've really figured out how to get along, how to cooperate. Sure, they have occasional differences, but Europe is a very stable place. And having brought in these 8 Central and East European countries did a lot for European stability. If you look at Asia, a country that's a region of the world that's very important, and China in particular, if you study Asia as an outsider, and I'm just doing that, reading my way into these debates, the very first thing you'll hear from everyone is, these guys hate each other. And then you talk to the Japanese, they tell you how awful the Chinese and the Koreans are, and the Koreans and the Chinese obviously tell you how horribly the Japanese treated them. And I just came back from a week's trip to Taiwan as an election observer. Here you can hear the 800-pound gorilla China is doing all these horrible things to Taiwan. And yes, there are quite a few things in that history that have gone wrong too. But Europe, in my mind, despite the fact that it has differences and problems, has come a long ways in terms of preventing further conflict among the members of the European Union. It seems to me that there are some lessons that the East Asians could take from this. And so my goal for the next project is to learn much more about East Asia and see whether some of the steps the Europeans have taken, for instance, with respect to reconciliation and then institution building over the course of more than 5 decades now, whether some of these lessons can be transferred to the Asian realm. And I recognize Asia is not Europe, but I think there's a lot that can be said for that. So I'll leave you with that.
Turkey into the European Union with 80 million people, that's going to cause a lot of problems with the different cultures of the Turks and the French and the Germans and so forth. It'd be almost like saying, well, let's have Mexico become part of the United States. There's many Mexicans that want to find a job in the United States, they can do that. And I think the Germans feel the same way. What's your feeling? How are they going to resolve that? Seems like the Achilles heel.
Yeah, you're right. Bringing Turkey into the European Union is highly problematic, and many people have talked about this. But my question is, would it not be more problematic to leave it out? If you're Germany, it's difficult to say, do not let Turkey in, because Germany has a significant Turkish population. Kreuzberg, a part of Berlin, has the second largest Turkish population outside of Turkey. And there are quite a few Turkish people now, not just in Germany, but also in France and several other EU member states, that actually by now are German or French or whatever citizens, right? They speak the language, they are integrated, not all of them, but there are quite a few now. And they feel that it's really in the interest of the European community to make that move, because leaving it out will risk that we move away from a fairly stable democracy, which Turkey is right now, and go back to the dark ages where we'll have divisions, where the country slides back from being a secular country, at least in terms of politics, to being run by religious fanatics. And that's why my argument was at least keep the carrot dangling, keep it dangling long, because right now it's clear if Turkey were to come into the EU, it wouldn't happen in the next 10 years. Maybe it would take 10 or 15 at least. And by then, a lot of change could happen, right? But will we see this? It's not clear. But the chances are better to see further reforms as long as Turkey thinks there's this possibility. Because the Turkish population already, it was much more pro-European Union. And when you look at polls, you'll see that many are fed up with the debates we're having in the EU and feel that this is demeaning for them and have now moved in a more anti-EU direction. And we don't want to see that happening, especially given the nature of the threats in the international environment right now. Right? Turkey is a key partner to stabilize this region of the world. So let it in or not let it in, certainly Germany would be crazy to veto this. And I know Angela Merkel is not excited about this. But at least let somebody else do it, because the ramifications will be huge. And all it takes is one country. And certainly the French are more anti-Turkey in the EU right now. But again, a lot can happen, right?
Get Luxembourg to it.
Yeah, but they have no incentive, basically, right? But yeah, you're right, it's a huge issue. But for domestic reasons, in many of the member states with large immigrant populations, it's not a good move. And alienating Turkey right now is also very destabilizing in my mind.
I was curious about Switzerland. What have they got to gain by not joining, or what do they have to lose by not joining?
Switzerland is an interesting case. Switzerland is wealthy, and it can do pretty much what it wants to do, and therefore has little interest in curtailing its sovereignty, its autonomy. It doesn't want to have to listen to what 27 other countries want before it can make a decision. Switzerland feels that things are good the way they are for it. So it just has never had an interest. Just like it's not involved militarily and declares neutrality time and time again, it has no interest in this closer association because the benefits from its perspective are not large enough.
I think I can talk loud enough. In the U.S.
It's working.
In the U.S., we seem to have had a pendulum shift over the millennium, the decades, for free trade, our attitude towards it. And right now, there seems to be a growing sentiment in the U.S. that free trade is bad for us. We're losing jobs to other countries, and well, it's bad for us. The question is does this same kind of tension go on among the EU members? Do they feel like they have this pendulum swinging back and forth, and they think it's a bad thing for them because they're losing jobs to other competitors?
Yes, I think the question is, the U.S. says free trade is good, but then oftentimes doesn't act in this manner. Do the Europeans have a similar debate going on? And yeah, it's the same thing. You hear we're pro-free trade, but you see a lot of impediments to free trade still. Even though we had the Single European Act passed that tried to get rid of these non-tariff barriers to trade, things like orderly marketing agreements, voluntary export restraints, and the likes. You still have things like CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, where you highly subsidize parts of agriculture. That's not free trade, right? So yes, we say we are pro-free trade, and we've done a lot to get rid of impediments, but there's still plenty in place. Right? And that was one of the complaints the Chinese just voiced. Why is Europe not doing more trade with China as a free trade loving geographic region? No, I'm sorry, I got the puzzle wrong. Africa complained about this. Africa wants much more support from Europe. China is the one who's making all the arrangement. So the Africans are saying, why are you European free trade loving folks are not investing heavily in Africa and help us build our infrastructures and so on? Well, they're not that free trade. China gets the contracts much more quickly because a lot of the impediments the Europeans still see in place can be done away with much more quickly by many of the Asian countries, actually. So I think that European-U.S. parallel is there, definitely.
I hate to admit it, but I was very impressed with the article that we were given to read on the European Union. I had no idea, I don't know how many people here had, how far along that organization has come, and apparently how important it is. And I just am amazed. I had no idea that the peacekeeping part that they share in the whole world, the amount of foreign aid, if this article is correct, then you can speak of that. But apparently they're not just looking internally, they're looking externally as well. And I'm just totally impressed with what I read and what you had to say. But I have a question, and that is that the Muslims apparently are coming into Europe, or have come into Europe in huge numbers. They're not assimilating. They're staying by themselves. They're becoming real problems. Europe has a negative birth rate among the Europeans. I doubt the Muslims do. Therefore, I'm asking you, the long term, what sort of change do you see in Europe and our relationship with Europe due to this constant erosion of the European culture, as you said, by these Muslims?
Yes, the large Muslim population in many European countries is viewed as a threat by many people within the European Union member states, but not by all. And actually the relations between the Muslim population and those European Union countries that have a large percentage of them has been better in the past and only more recently has soured. And it's because of some of these events that clearly were horrific but also have gotten a lot of publicity. In the post-9/11 environment, we look at the world differently than we did previously. So oftentimes people who have no ill intentions are immediately viewed as a threat just because they're different than we are. So that, I think that's one thing we need to observe. So many of the particularly more liberal European countries, think about Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, have gone out of their way to integrate the Muslim population. And some have done that quite successfully. You also see some of these examples in Germany. It's the case I know best, but certainly in the Netherlands, many of the Muslims were well integrated. But then things happened like a filmmaker who made this documentary about Muslims got knifed to death by a fanatic. A member of, what parliament was it? The Dutch parliament, maybe? A Muslim, was it? A woman in the Dutch parliament had death threats, then came to the United States, now is trying to come back to the Netherlands. There were a few cases in various countries where you had scapegoats and the more uneducated part of the population rallied around people who were trying to create trouble. And so you're right that many people are not sufficiently integrated, not successfully integrated, but various programs had been put in place, and in some parts of the European Union this has worked pretty well. And now it seems that we've gone back into the dark ages on account of these few incidences. So now various of the EU governments have put significant pots of money aside, trying to create programs already from the earliest stages in the kindergarten age to try to promote this integration, because we recognize that we need to get along, that we can't take entire parts of the population and say they'll never be like we are, and therefore we will treat them in a fashion that's not acceptable if you're a humanist, certainly, right? So yes, it's a significant problem, but many of the governments have recognized this, and they also recognize that they need these people for the reason you've mentioned, that the population is aging, a percentage of old people, retired people is increasing in many of these EU countries, and we need labor. And we want to have people who are happy living in these countries rather than people who are being alienated and who get beaten up by right-wing groups that just don't understand the value of immigration and integration.
Excuse me, what about Norway?
What about Norway? Norway is an interesting case because one of the big trade sectors, I can't see where the question came from and therefore don't know whom to address it. Sorry. So why Norway is not in the European Union is the question. Norway is interesting because a big part of its trade is fisheries. And it felt that it would do much better being in charge of its own fisheries and that aspect of trade than having to curtail its autonomy by becoming a member of the EU. So it was in the vote, in the national election, it was largely the the fishery group that killed that referendum for membership, because it was up for membership along with Sweden. And
I have another question. The other question, you mentioned that the European members like to choose the route of peace and diplomacy as opposed to war. How do they handle the Madrid bombings, the London bombings, and the riots in France? Is there any unification in attacking that threat of terror?
yeah, I think the first thing I want to say, the question is, how are these European countries dealing with things like the Madrid bombings and terrorist attacks in various parts of Europe? First thing, of course, is that by saying that the Europeans do not have a common foreign and security policy and only have a European rapid reaction force but no European army, doesn't mean they're anti-military and they're pacifists through and through. They clearly care about the well-being of their citizens. And so, yes, they do have militaries, but they don't think that terrorism can effectively be dealt with through military measures alone. And so, for instance, a main focus of the European Union in this post-9/11 world with respect to terrorism is much greater intelligence sharing, to figure out what people are up to in various countries and report where these cells of terrorists are located, and then try to catch these guys before they can even detonate bombs and blow up citizens of the EU country. They also work closely with the U.S. on this, obviously, because terrorism is a global problem, but it's much more by way of intelligence sharing. Another way of trying to deal with this is trying to give those who are disgruntled, those sections of society, a stake in society. Give them a reason to live for. So try to bring these people back into mainstream society by creating job programs, providing better housing, creating better educational opportunities, and the like. So they're addressing this differently. They're trying to nip the problem in the bud, so to speak, rather than trying to figure out predominantly what to do after something like this has happened.
Just curious, in recent years, change in leadership in France and Germany with respect to relations with the United States is, let's say, improved according to the mainstream media. Do you have any ideas why those two countries changed? Was the pressure from the local citizens, other reasons, economic, otherwise, and what influence could this possibly develop since France and Germany have changed with other European countries that may not be as warm or as changing in the direction of the United States?
Mm-hmm. So the question is, France and Germany have changed their relationship toward the United States more recently with changes in leadership in these countries, and how can we account for that, essentially? People matter, so a change in leadership also matters. You have different personalities, but you also have different political parties in power. Certainly in the case of Germany, you now have a Christian Democrat rather than a social democrat. Angela Merkel, my assessment is just a very good diplomat. She comes into politics as a scientist. I think she's a physicist by training, from formerly East Germany, from the German Democratic Republic. So she has figured out how to compromise, how to negotiate effectively, and how oftentimes to get what she wants. She has also shown that in the EU, that during the 6 months where the Germans held the EU presidency and where she negotiated that new constitutional treaty. So I think in part you can explain it by personality, but also by change in party. A Christian Democratic Party is more conservative than a Social Democratic Party, and therefore with respect to several issue areas she sees more eye to eye on with the US. But I'm not sure, and of course I have no way of really knowing, if Angela Merkel had been Chancellor of Germany during the time when Germany had to decide whether to aid the U.S. during the Iraq War, my hunch is she would have also said no. She would have said it more diplomatically than Schröder. Schröder said it the way he did because it was an election year, and for him it was this all or nothing. He hoped that if he stood up to the U.S., that would give him votes. So he did that way. Merkel, my hunch is also would have for similar reasons, but she would have couched it in more diplomatic language. Because Germans, regardless of whether you have Christian Democrats or Social Democrats in power, believe that decisions like going to war with Iraq have to go through the United Nations. That is the organization that provides legitimacy to these decisions. And this is not what had happened. And so Angela Merkel, my guess is, also would have asked for the inspectors to have been given a further chance to figure out whether there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq or not before she would have okayed that. So I think it is a change in personality, and similarly in France. I think Sarkozy also is trying to get along with President Bush because he recognizes then he can get other things that he likes to get.
The text refers to the fact that some of the European countries are apparently maintaining some level of diplomatic relationships with Iran. Given several of your comments there, which you remarked on whether or not the policies of the United States should be more aware of the value of diplomacy instead of using warfare as a means of forced diplomacy.
It seems to me when we talk about Iran, it should be in the U.S.'s interest to give a chance to any negotiations that it imagines can go somewhere in the right direction. France had significant ties with Iran for a number of years, and therefore it's not inconceivable that a French delegation could make a difference and could lead to a breakthrough. I think the Europeans feel in general that they need to negotiate, at least make an effort, because they are afraid that if they don't do that, that Iran could see a similar fate as Iraq. And for Europe, geographically much closer located to Iran than the U.S., that's a real threat. Also, if you look at individual countries, Iran, as we know, poses a threat to Israel, and there are obviously very strong ties now with Germany and Israel. France, on the other hand, always plays the role of balancing this relationship by being more pro-Arab. And so I think this whole Middle East peace issue is obviously tied into stability in Iran as well. And so the Europeans feel it's very much in their interest to become involved in this. And it only makes sense that the U.S. Would look upon these negotiations favorably and see whether they can lead to a successful outcome before the U.S. has to take next steps. Similarly to these questions on should the U.S. Be in favor of the Europeans doing more in defense. Of course, if the U.S. doesn't have to do it alone, it's better to have allies than to have to go it alone, right? It seems to me.
Just a quick question. Will we soon be able to travel freely among the EU member states without customs? Do you foresee that in the near future?
Does that mean you as an American, you need to get into the EU, so you show your passport, but once you're in, you can travel anywhere you want. And the Europeans can already do that to the extent that there's this Schengen agreement. I always have to look up which countries are in now, because some of the Central and East European countries, not all of them are in yet. But the borders are gone among almost all of these 27 member states. So once you make it into the European Union, then there are no borders. You go from Germany to France or Germany to Austria or any of those. Nobody will ever stop you and ask you for a passport. So,
what is the legal justification for abandoning the 6-month rotating presidency and going to a 5-year elected president? And how will that affect the power structure between the Commission and the Parliament and so forth?
okay, why abandon the 6-month, the legal basis for the 6-month EU presidency going to 5-year term? It's actually that the presidency will rotate every 2.5 years instead of 6 months, but that people are elected for 5-year terms within the different institutions. The rationale for moving from 6 months to 2.5 years is that 6 months is not a long enough time to really get used to anything. It's a terribly long time to hold the EU presidency if you're a small country, because that puts a lot of administrative burden on you. If you're a large country, it's much easier. So there was discussion of having several countries sharing the presidency. But the learning curve is pretty steep, and so to change every 6 months is just way too frequently. And so the Europeans decided that it makes more sense to make the span longer, and they've decided 2.5 years. They don't want to make it too long because those countries that hold the presidency set the agenda for the European Union for that period. And an agenda setter, as we all know, can put things on the agenda that that country finds particularly important or favorable for its own domestic policy. And so you don't want to make the individual member states too powerful, but at the same time, you don't want to have a country that takes the presidency and before it really knows the ropes, it has to hand it off again. The country with the presidency right now is Slovenia. And that's tough, right? It's a new EU member state. It has been on board since 2004. So it's tough for a country like that to be able to pull that off. If you're really interested in Slovenia's presidency, I can invite you to a talk. You can't all come because then the room won't fit, but a few of you could come. We have the ambassador of Slovenia speaking at my European Union Center at Georgia Tech on February 19th from 1:30 to 3. So if you're interested, you can send me an email and I can tell you the room and you can hear what Slovenia plans for its presidency. And if you're really interested in transatlantic relations, I'm hosting the following day, so February 20th, I'm hosting Carsten Vogt, who is Angela Merkel's, the German chancellor's expert on transatlantic relations. I'm hosting him on the 20th, 9:30 to 11:20. So again, if that's something you would, if you really would like to hear these people, I invite you. So you could come.
Do you foresee that, for example, Britain and Cyprus, whose currency is far surpassing the euro at the moment, if the euro should ever reach parity, do you foresee that they would accept it as their currency?
I think Britain is really tough to figure out what Britain wants to do with respect to currency. It obviously was invited to join the euro, and it could have met the criteria, but Britain is difficult when it comes to the European Union. Britain also was invited to join the European Union when the Treaties of Rome were signed, then the European Community, one should accurately say, and decided not to because it didn't want to curtail its sovereignty that way. It, instead of joining the European Community in 1957, decided to create the European Free Trade Area, EFTA. Right? It decided later that that was a poor decision. It begged the European Community to come on board, And Charles de Gaulle at the time in the 60s said, over my dead body, these guys were not willing to come in the late 50s when it took risks, and we're not letting them in. That's why it took till 73 for them to get in. Euro, the same thing. They could have gotten in. They said, well, let's let the others be guinea pigs. We'll see whether this works out. Now that the euro has proven wildly successful, maybe they will reconsider this. But it's not the common currency alone that they exempted themselves. They also exempted themselves from a lot of social policies that they are afraid will interfere with their domestic politics. So they like to play this role of outsider to the extent that they can get away with it.
Could you discuss a little bit the EU's relationship or feelings about the increasing aggressiveness of Russia?
The EU's increasing aggressiveness, aside from Russia, the other way around. I'm really not sure that the European Union is that concerned about this, because there's NATO to deal with these issues, and the European Union has always been faithful to NATO decisions. So if we ever were to run into serious problems with Russia, I think that's where the European Union would act through NATO, because then it has the biggest supporter it would need for something like that, which is, of course, the United States. Is it disturbed by the rhetoric? Yes. Is it upset with Putin about lots of policies he's pursued recently? Yes, definitely. In fact, Senator Nunn, after whom my faculty, my department is named, will make a trip to Russia with William Perry and who's the other person? Kissinger, to talk to Putin about these issues. So there will be cooperation on the side of the Europeans too, because they're stopping by and talking to the German foreign minister on their way to see how best to handle the situation. So yes, it's on their radar screen, but I don't think it will lead to major fallouts between Russia and the EU.
In the text today, it talked about technology and some of the frustrations that Europe has had, and putting some common things together. How come we don't see incredible success stories, like if in the computer stuff you would think of Intel with the hardware, or maybe the latest examples like Google? Why don't we see something like that in Europe?
Why do we not see more high-tech developments, particularly with respect to computer development, software, and so on? I think the answer is that Germans in their educational system totally neglected this area. They've recognized it. That's why they've come up with what's called the blue card instead of the green card, where they're now allowing those who are very savvy in these areas, oftentimes students from India, other Asian countries, to now come and get work permits for various EU member states. Germany, I think, pioneered this, but other states are following suit, because we just didn't put a lot of emphasis on this. We're good in certain areas. Think about Siemens, think about the automobile industry, phone industry also, right? It's not that we're not savvy enough to be able to produce high-tech products, but we've totally neglected this area. And now we're catching up, and we're paying for it. So we have to come up with programs in the meantime till our youth is computer savvy and can move into these areas of industrial development. I think that's the answer.
Okay, it is time to close our program, and thank you again, Dr. Weber.